Throughout our planet's history, unbelievable catastrophes have occurred. Unexpected tragedies have devastated entire cities. At times, strange phenomena appeared that, while not causing a high death toll, left people unsettled. Other times, cataclysmic events were triggered by giants arriving from space. In this documentary, we'll explore some of Earth's most devastating catastrophes. From natural disasters to incidents caused by humankind. The Tunguska Event. On June 30th, 1908, in a remote region of Siberia, something utterly extraordinary was about to happen. It was early morning. A profound silence enveloped the surroundings. The air was icy, and the stillness felt almost supernatural. A pale sun began to rise over the horizon, its rays barely piercing through the tops of the pine trees. Suddenly, the northern sky lit up, as if a second sun had emerged. A ball of fire streaked across the sky, leaving behind a blazing trail that tore through the atmosphere. The phenomenon was so bright that its light was visible even in broad daylight. The fireball, a meteoroid, was traveling at a speed beyond human comprehension. Within seconds, it exploded, about 5 kilometers above the Earth's surface. As it disintegrated in the air, its energy was released all at once, causing an atmospheric explosion. It was so powerful that it leveled the surrounding forest. About 80 million trees were knocked down, as if they were mere matchsticks. But the most unsettling part was the silence that followed the explosion. After the shockwave swept through the region, everything was left in a deathly silence. Broken only by the creaking of fallen trees. The area was so remote that most people were far from the epicenter. However, hundreds of reindeer, vital to the local tribes, perished in the blast. The Apocalypse of Mount Pelée. The residents of Saint-Pierre had noticed the volcano beginning to emit columns of smoke and ash since early April. Small tremors shook the island of Martinique, and ash rains blanketed the sugarcane plantations. Yet, most people, reassured by the lack of major eruptions in the past, chose to stay. On May 8, 1902, the quiet island was about to witness a catastrophic event. At dawn, the air was thick with tropical humidity, and an eerie calm enveloped the surroundings. Mount Pelée, which had been showing signs of activity for weeks, loomed ominously over the town of Saint-Pierre. A deafening roar echoed from deep within the earth. The sky darkened to a deep gray as a cloud of volcanic ash and gas rose swiftly. A searing avalanche of gas, ash, and rock surged down from the volcano's slopes. Within seconds, the pyroclastic cloud reached Saint-Pierre. The city was engulfed in an inferno of fire and destruction. The heat, so intense that wooden buildings ignited instantly. The bodies of the inhabitants were charred upon contact with the blazing avalanche. Within minutes, Saint-Pierre, known as the Paris of the Caribbean, was annihilated. At least 30,000 people lost their lives, making the eruption one of the worst volcanic tragedies of the 20th century. After the disaster, the city lay in ruins, blanketed by a thick layer of ash and volcanic rock. Mount Pelée, once a symbol of pride, became a grim testament to the power of nature. The collapse of Minoan civilization. Around 3,600 years ago, on the island of Thera, now known as Santorini in the Aegean Sea, an apocalyptic eruption was brewing. Akrotiri, Thera's main settlement, was a testament to the advanced engineering of the Minoans. The Minoans, whose center was on the island of Crete, were a civilization skilled in navigation and trade. Thera, as part of their network of settlements, became a strategic point for trade routes. But beneath the island's surface, magma was silently gathering, preparing for a catastrophe that would alter the course of this civilization. One day, the ground began to shake violently. The volcano, dormant for centuries, awakened with an explosion that shook the entire Mediterranean. Terrifying blasts released vast amounts of volcanic ash, toxic gases, and rock fragments. The eruption was so powerful that the island collapsed at its center, forming a massive caldera. It's believed that some islanders had time to escape by boat to other islands, or the mainland. Akrotiri was completely buried under a thick layer of volcanic ash. Amazingly, this might have happened within minutes. In explosive eruptions, eruptive columns rise rapidly due to the intense release of volcanic gases and pyroclastic material. The vast quantities of rocks and ash hurled into the sea triggered a devastating tsunami that swept across the coasts of Crete and nearby islands. The Minoan civilization, which had ruled the Aegean Sea for centuries, was struck at its core and never recovered. More than a millennium later, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two enigmatic dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In them, he recounted the story of a prosperous civilization called Atlantis. He described it as a technologically advanced society with a formidable army and unimaginable wealth. But in a single day and night, it was destroyed and submerged beneath the sea by a cataclysm. It's intriguing to think that the story of Thera's eruption passed down through generations, might have reached Plato. Over centuries, the tale could have been handed down, blending with inaccuracies or myths, to become the legend the philosopher described. The volcanic fury of Tambora. It is considered one of the deadliest eruptions in human history. On April 10, 1815, on the remote island of Sumbawa, Indonesia, the day began like any other. Yet, something ominous was brewing deep within the volcano. The ground shook with a deafening roar, followed by an explosion that rocked the entire island. A column of ash and burning gases rose, darkening the sky even in daylight. The eruption was so powerful that it was heard 2,000 kilometers away. In distant places like Sumatra and Java, Mount Tambora, dormant for centuries, turned into a cauldron of destruction. The explosion released immense energy, comparable to the simultaneous detonation of hundreds of nuclear bombs. Pyroclastic flows surged down with astonishing speed, obliterating entire villages in seconds. Nearby islands, once green and fertile, were buried under the volcanic ash. The eruption also triggered tsunamis that struck the shores, amplifying the destruction and loss of life. It's estimated that at least 70,000 people died directly from the eruption, tsunamis, and toxic gas inhalation. But the true scale of the disaster was felt far beyond the island. The eruption ejected enormous amounts of volcanic material into the atmosphere. The following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Sulfur particles and ash spread worldwide, blocking sunlight and causing global cooling. The sky remained cloaked in a strange haze across much of the world. In New England, United States, snowstorms were reported in the middle of summer. In Europe, relentless rains and unusually low temperatures ruined wheat and corn harvests. In Asia, the monsoon rains intensified, leading to catastrophic floods. The global climate even inspired writers like Mary Shelley, who amidst this gloomy setting wrote Frankenstein. The Tri-State Tornado. On March 18, 1925, the sky over the Midwest of the United States darkened, the beginning of one of the worst tornadoes in history. A powerful mass of warm, humid air rose from the Gulf of Mexico, meeting a front of cold air moving in from the Rocky Mountains. This clash generated a massive supercell, which quickly began rotating, forming a super tornado. What emerged from this storm was a giant of nature. The Tri-State Tornado touched down in southeastern Missouri, near the town of Ellington. From that point, it moved with unprecedented ferocity and consistency. Later classified as an F5, it began its path of destruction. Its speed and the long duration of its track led it to devastate entire towns. Along its path, it destroyed numerous communities, starting with the small town of Annapolis. Homes, schools, and businesses were torn from their foundations and thrown into the air. It continued northeast, crossing the Mississippi River and entering Illinois, where it struck the city of Murfreesboro with full force. Its destructive path persisted toward DeSoto, a small town left completely leveled. It kept moving into Indiana, where it extended its trail of devastation. The tornado caused nearly 700 deaths, becoming the deadliest tornado in U.S. history. The Carrington Geomagnetic Storm. On September 1, 1859, Earth was struck by one of the most intense solar events ever recorded. It all started on the sun's surface, where massive sunspots signaled unusual activity. Astronomers, including Richard Carrington, were closely observing these phenomena when an intense solar flare erupted. The flare was so powerful that it sent a gigantic cloud of plasma and magnetic fields directly toward Earth. What would normally have taken several days arrived in just 17 hours. As it collided with Earth's magnetic field, an unprecedented geomagnetic storm unfolded. The night sky lit up with auroras so bright they were visible in places like the Caribbean. Red, green, and purple hues colored the skies, startling and alarming people. But the true effects of the geomagnetic storm were yet to be seen. In Europe and North America, telegraph lines became overloaded with energy. Operators reported sparks flying from their equipment, causing fires. Total chaos broke out in communications. Fortunately, no deaths were attributed to the storm. If an event of this magnitude happened today, the effects would be disastrous for our society. Satellites in orbit, power grids, GPS systems, and global communications would be severely impacted or disabled. The global financial market, which relies on electronic transactions, would be disrupted, leading to stock market crashes. The lack of power, communication, and essential services would create social chaos, with possible unrest in major cities. The Awakening of Mount Vesuvius. On August 24th, in the year 79, Mount Vesuvius, a volcano on the Bay of Naples, Italy, unleashed a devastating volcanic event. That morning began like any other in the prosperous Roman city of Pompeii. In the days prior, small tremors had been felt, though they caused little concern. However, shortly before noon, Vesuvius suddenly and violently awakened. A colossal column of ash and volcanic gases rose into the sky. It spread out, blocking daylight and plunging Pompeii into darkness. The eruption's first phase covered nearby towns with a rain of ash and volcanic rock. stones piled up on rooftops, causing buildings to collapse. People found themselves trapped in their homes, unable to escape the growing danger. But the worst was yet to come. Around midnight, Vesuvius entered a more destructive phase, the release of pyroclastic flows. Blazing clouds of gas, ash, and rock surged down at speeds of up to 700 kilometers per hour. They obliterated everything in their path, killing anyone in range with extreme heat reaching up to 5,000 degrees Celsius. Those who hadn't escaped were caught in their homes or in the streets, where they perished instantly, buried under layers of burning ash. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, thousands lost their lives in this way. The Roman Empire, and particularly Emperor Titus, became aware of the disaster. Titus, who had assumed command just a year prior, ordered rescue and reconstruction efforts to begin. Yet, the scale of the tragedy was such that Pompeii, Herculaneum, and nearby towns remained buried and were never rebuilt. Centuries later, the ruins were uncovered, revealing to the world the catastrophe that had taken place. The Lituya Bay Mega Tsunami. On July 9, 1958, the remote Lituya Bay in Alaska became the scene of a mega tsunami. It began with a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, with its epicenter located near the Fairweather Fault. The quake shook the region, causing the collapse of a nearby mountainside into the bay. An enormous mass of rock and soil broke free from the mountain, plunging into the fjord of Lituya Bay. This landslide struck the water with unimaginable force, generating a colossal wave. The initial wave reached a height of 524 meters, the highest ever recorded. It swept up the fjord's slopes, tearing out trees and leaving a visible scar of destruction, even today. The tsunami's power was so immense that it carried massive trees and tons of debris into the open ocean. Three fishing boats were in the bay at the time and were caught by the wave. Two sank, but the third miraculously survived. Lifting the crew high above the bay before dropping them back down. Despite the wave's magnitude, only 5 people died in the disaster due to the area's sparse population. A great flood? The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known poem, describes how the gods decided to flood the earth as punishment for humanity. In this story, the hero, Gilgamesh, seeks immortality and journeys to find Utnapishtim, the only man to survive a great flood. Utnapishtim recounts how the gods, angered by human behavior, resolved to destroy all living beings with a massive deluge. The god Ea, compassionate toward humans, warned Utnapishtim and advised him to build a great boat. Following divine instructions, Utnapishtim constructed it, bringing his family, animals of every kind, and seeds of plants on board. For 6 days and 7 nights, rain poured relentlessly, flooding the earth and wiping out all life. On the 7th day, the waters began to recede, and Utnapishtim's boat came to rest on Mount Nisir. To see if the land had dried, he first sent out a dove, then a swallow, and finally a raven. The raven did not return, signaling it had found solid ground. Centuries later, similar stories were written. According to the Bible, Noah was a just and righteous man at a time when humanity had become corrupt. Seeing the wickedness of the people, God decided to send a flood to cleanse the earth, destroying all life, except Noah and his family. God commanded Noah to build an ark, providing detailed instructions on its size and shape. For 40 days and 40 nights rain fell, covering the entire land. mighty ark floated through the flood, and all life outside of it perished. After Noah sent out a dove that returned with an olive branch, he knew the land was drying. The connection between the flood story and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Bible is a topic of debate. Some suggest that both accounts may stem from a historical flood in the ancient Near East. Mesopotamian civilization thrived between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, an area prone to seasonal flooding. At times, these were destructive floods, sweeping away towns and villages. Another possibility proposes an event around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Glaciers began to melt, releasing colossal amounts of water and causing a worldwide rise in sea levels. This could have indirectly affected Mesopotamia, particularly in coastal areas near the Persian Gulf. The Chicxulub event. Around 66 million years ago, in deep space, a massive meteorite, about 15 kilometers wide, was speeding through. This celestial body, likely originating in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, was headed toward our planet. As the meteorite entered Earth's atmosphere, it was traveling at an incredible speed. Friction with the air wasn't enough to slow it down. Instead, it heated it into a blazing fireball. The impact took place in what is now Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Upon striking Earth, it released energy equivalent to billions of atomic bombs. The explosion vaporized everything at its epicenter, scattering debris and ash in all directions. In the area near the impact, the energy released was so immense that it incinerated all forms of life. The collision generated massive shockwaves that spread rapidly across the land, causing colossal earthquakes. Since the meteorite struck near the ocean, it triggered gigantic tsunamis that devastated nearby coastlines. Additionally, the impact hurled large amounts of Earth's rocks and meteorite fragments into the atmosphere, which rained down as an apocalyptic shower of debris. Forest fires spread across entire continents. Dust and particles thrown into the atmosphere blocked sunlight, plunging the planet into near-total darkness. This impact winter caused a dramatic drop in global temperatures. Plants deprived of light began to die off, followed by herbivores that depended on them. Within a matter of years, most dinosaur species vanished. Yet, in this catastrophe, life found a new opportunity. The extinction of the dinosaurs allowed mammals, which were then small, to have a chance to thrive. Over time, evolution favored mammals with larger brains and advanced cognitive abilities. This was crucial for the development of intelligence in primates, the group of mammals from which humans descend. The 8.2 kiloyear event. Around 8,200 years ago, Earth went through an abrupt climate change. It began with the disintegration of the Laurentide ice sheet. Which covered what is now Canada. As the climate warmed, following the end of the last ice age, massive glaciers started to melt. This melting created enormous glacial lakes, including Lake Agassiz, held back by an ice barrier acting as a natural dam. At the lake's edge, pressure built up. The ice dam weakened under the rising heat. Suddenly, the ice barrier collapsed. A colossal mass of fresh water was unleashed in a cataclysm that poured into the North Atlantic. This surge of cold, fresh water, equivalent to multiple inland seas combined, disrupted ocean currents. The result was an abrupt temperature drop in the northern hemisphere, lasting around 200 years. The climate turned cold and dry, severely affecting human communities reliant on farming and hunting. The cooling effects were disastrous for early agricultural civilizations. In Europe, the Middle East, and North America, early farmers faced unpredictable and less fertile climates. Crops failed, and lands once rich became barren. The tragedy of Lake Nyos. In 1986, in a remote mountainous area of northwest Cameroon, a natural phenomenon, both unexpected and deadly, took place. Nyos, a seemingly harmless volcanic lake, appeared peaceful at first glance. But beneath its surface, a deadly threat had been building up slowly. For years, volcanic origin carbon dioxide had been seeping from underground, dissolving into the lake's deep waters. Over time, the lake became a death trap, storing a massive amount of gas at its bottom. The tragedy began on the night of August 21st. An unknown phenomenon, possibly a landslide or minor volcanic eruption, disturbed the lake's waters. This triggered a process called a limnic eruption, suddenly releasing the carbon dioxide trapped in the lake's lower layers. A massive, heavy, and invisible cloud of carbon dioxide rose from the lake and quickly drifted toward nearby villages. The gas, denser than air, flowed down the valley, suffocating all living beings in its path. Within minutes, the gas cloud reached the villages of Nyos, Kam, and Cha. At least 1,700 people died in their beds from asphyxiation, many without realizing what was happening. Thousands of animals also perished. The Chernobyl accident. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear plant experienced a disaster due to human error. A test was planned to see if, in the event of a power outage, the reactor's turbines would generate enough electricity. Before the test, operators reduced the reactor's power to an excessively low level. They disabled key safety systems, including those that would automatically shut down the reactor if issues arose. At 1:23 a.m., the reactor exploded, releasing a cloud of radiation into the sky. The blast was so powerful that the reactor's 1,000-ton roof was blown off, with flames lighting up the night. Radiation, invisible and deadly, began spreading rapidly. Firefighters battled the flames and radiation, unaware they were facing a certain death. The disaster claimed 31 lives immediately, but radiation doomed many more. Thousands of people developed serious illnesses in the years that followed. In Pripyat, thousands of residents abandoned their homes, leaving their lives behind in a desperate exodus. The streets were left deserted, buildings frozen in time, and nature began to reclaim the land. The consequences of Chernobyl were global. The radioactive cloud spread across Europe, carrying fear with it. The Indian Ocean Tsunami. On the morning of December 26, 2004, the calm of the Indian Ocean was brutally shattered. A 9.1 magnitude earthquake, one of the most powerful recorded in history, shook the seabed off the coast of Sumatra. The ocean floor suddenly rose, displacing a massive amount of water and triggering a colossal tsunami. Within minutes, a series of giant waves began to spread at an astonishing speed. Before the tsunami struck the shores of Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries, a strange and terrifying phenomenon occurred. The sea began to recede abruptly. Within minutes, the ocean that once lapped at the shore pulled back, exposing the seabed. Beaches that were covered by water just moments before now revealed wet sand, rocks, and marine creatures. This phenomenon, known as sea withdrawal, is a clear and dangerous sign of an impending tsunami. In Thailand and Indonesia, many people, unaware of the danger, approached the new shoreline, fascinated by what was happening. Invisible in the open sea, the waves gained strength and height as they neared the coasts, transforming into walls of water. The first impact struck the shores of Sumatra, where waves up to 30 meters high arrived. Entire towns were flooded, and thousands of people were swept away by the unstoppable force of the water. The tsunami continued its path, hitting the shores of Thailand, India, and Sri Lanka, reaching even the coasts of East Africa. Scenes of destruction were unimaginable. Homes destroyed, trees uprooted, and vehicles piled up. Over 2,300 people lost their lives, and millions were left homeless. The Lisbon earthquake and tsunami. On November 1, 1755, Lisbon, the thriving capital of Portugal, was about to face an unimaginable disaster. It was a clear morning. The sun shone over the city's narrow streets, and church bells echoed in the air. Suddenly, a terrifying tremor shook the city. Buildings began to sway and collapse. Elegant Baroque facades turned to rubble, and the streets filled with dust and chaos. The earthquake, estimated at a magnitude between 8.5 and 9, lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was devastating. As the ground continued to shake, survivors sought refuge in open squares and by the Tagus River, believing they would be safe. Yet, the danger was not over. Minutes after the earthquake, the Atlantic waters began to recede, leaving ships stranded on the harbor floor. Unexpectedly, a massive tsunami struck the coast, destroying everything in its path. The water swept away houses and people, surging deep into the city. The terror continued as fires began to spread. Flames, fanned by the wind, consumed buildings that had withstood both the earthquake and tsunami. For days, Lisbon burned, and smoke cloaked the sky in a dark cloud. The city, once a symbol of wealth, was reduced to smoldering ruins. The disaster affected more than just Lisbon. It struck other parts of the Atlantic coast, reaching places as far as Cadiz in Spain and the shores of Morocco. Waves crossed the ocean, even reaching the Caribbean's Antilles. The scale of the catastrophe shook Europe's consciousness, sparking philosophical debates on the fragility of human existence. Lisbon, once shining like a jewel of the Atlantic, was forever scarred by this tragedy. It's estimated that between 30,000 and 70,000 people lost their lives. The Toba super eruption. Around 74,000 years ago, on what is now the island of Sumatra, Indonesia, a cataclysmic event was about to alter the course of human history. The Toba volcano, dormant for millennia, erupted with a force that echoed across the globe. It released an immense amount of magma, burying a vast area of Southeast Asia under a thick layer of volcanic ash. The sky darkened swiftly, shrouded by a massive ash cloud. Day turned to night, and global temperatures began to fall. This was a super eruption, a volcanic event of incomprehensible magnitude. The materials expelled by Toba triggered a volcanic winter that lasted for several years. Global temperatures plummeted, sparking a temporary ice age with devastating effects on the flora and fauna of the time. Across vast regions of the planet, plants died, unable to survive the lack of sunlight. Animals dependent on these plants, as well as those unable to adapt to the new climate, also perished in large numbers. Additionally, it's believed that the Toba super eruption nearly wiped out humanity. Some propose that the human population was reduced to a small group of survivors, possibly between 1,000 and 10,000 individuals. This genetic bottleneck caused a notable decrease in the genetic diversity of the human species. Lake Toba, now one of Indonesia's major tourist attractions, is what remains of the volcanic caldera after the eruption. The Daulatpur Saturya tornado. On April 26, 1989, the sky over the villages of Daulatpur and Saturya in Bangladesh darkened ominously. The humid heat, typical of monsoon season, had begun to build up. Warm, moist air currents from the Bay of Bengal collided with a mass of cool, dry air descending from the north. This mixture of air, combined with low atmospheric pressure, created the perfect conditions for a supercell to form. The sky grew darker, and the clouds began to swirl violently. Amidst the storm, a vortex took shape, slowly descending from the sky until it touched the ground. What began as a small swirl grew into a monstrous tornado. Winds exceeded 400 kilometers per hour. It moved directly over the villages of Daulatpur and Saturia, where most homes were made of adobe and thatched roofs. In an instant, they were torn from their foundations and hurled into the air. Trees were uprooted and flung about, while livestock and people were swept away, unable to find shelter. The villages were reduced to rubble, leaving a scene of utter devastation. Livestock, essential to the local economy, was nearly wiped out. Around 1,300 people lost their lives, and thousands were injured. The Bola Cyclone. On November 12, 1970, a tropical storm formed in the Bay of Bengal, south of Asia. The warm ocean waters fueled the system, transforming it into a cyclone of extraordinary magnitude. As Cyclone Bola neared the coast of Bangladesh, its winds reached speeds of up to 185 kilometers per hour. The storm churned the sea, creating a massive storm surge. When the cyclone made landfall, ocean water rushed over the lowlands of the Ganges Delta. Giant waves, up to 10 meters high, swept through coastal villages. Mud and thatch homes crumbled under the fury of the water, leaving millions exposed to the storm. With its deadly combination of hurricane-force winds and flooding, the cyclone claimed over 300,000 lives in a matter of hours. Villages were submerged, and fields were destroyed, leaving millions without a livelihood. The consequences of Cyclone Bola were catastrophic, not only in terms of lives lost, but also in its political impact. The inadequate response of the Pakistani government to the crisis sparked a wave of discontent that ultimately led to the Bangladesh Independence War in 1971. The impact of S2 on primordial Earth. Around 3 billion years ago, S2, a colossal asteroid nearly 50 kilometers in diameter, approached Earth from the depths of the solar system. It was significantly larger than the asteroid that would later end the age of the dinosaurs. The sky lit up with a blinding flash as S2 entered Earth's atmosphere, traveling at extreme speeds. In an instant, the asteroid crashed into Earth, releasing energy equivalent to about 700 Hiroshima bombs. The impact created an enormous crater, vaporizing everything in the surrounding area. The ground shook violently, and shockwaves rippled across the planet, shaking newly formed continents. The nearby ocean, struck with unimaginable force, rose into a massive wave. A mega tsunami with waves reaching unimaginable heights swept across coastlines, destroying everything in its path. The devastation was absolute. The atmosphere filled with dust and debris, blocking sunlight and plunging the Earth into prolonged darkness. This cataclysm altered the course of evolution on Earth, triggering a mass extinction that reshaped the primitive ecosystem. The climate grew unstable, temperatures plummeted, and life struggled to survive in a world transformed by disaster. The mega landslide of Mount Took. On October 9, 1963, tragedy struck in the mountains of the Eastern Alps in northern Italy. Mount Took had shown signs of instability for years. Cracks in the rocks and land movements had been recorded ever since the Vosges Dam was built in the valley. This dam created an enormous reservoir, with waters rising dangerously close to the mountain slopes. As the water level in the reservoir rose, so did the pressure on the valley walls. On October 9th, after a day of heavy rain, the situation reached a critical point. At around 10:39 p.m., a massive section of Mount Tox slope broke off and plummeted into the reservoir. The landslide was so immense that it displaced a colossal amount of water, generating a gigantic wave. The wave surged over the top of the Vosges Dam, crashing down into the valley with force. Water mixed with mud and debris swept away everything in its path. The villages of Longarone, Pirego, Villanova, and other small settlements were completely obliterated. Homes were swept away, trees uprooted, and streets turned into rivers of destruction. Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives, many of them while asleep in their homes. The Fukushima nuclear accident. On March 11, 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake shook Japan's northeast coast. Giant waves, some up to 40 meters or 131 feet high, devastated villages and cities. Buildings, vehicles, and boats were swept away, and the infrastructure was destroyed within minutes. The tsunami claimed the lives of nearly 20,000 people. But the danger didn't stop there. There was a significant risk that the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant could be damaged. Waves breached the plant's defenses, flooding the emergency generators that kept the nuclear reactors cool. Without power or cooling systems, the reactors began to overheat, and within hours, a nuclear disaster was imminent. Hydrogen explosions in 3 reactors shattered the buildings housing them, releasing radiation into the environment. Authorities evacuated thousands of people, but radiation spread, contaminating land, water, and air over a substantial area. Although there were no immediate deaths directly attributed to radiation exposure, the disaster had severe effects on the health and welfare of those affected. Locally, the Fukushima region turned into a series of ghost towns. Farmers lost their lands, and fishing was halted due to radioactive contamination. The Yellow River Flood. In the summer of 1931, in the heart of China, nature began to unleash its fury relentlessly. The Yellow River, known as China's Sorrow for its history of disasters, was on the verge of causing an unimaginable tragedy. Torrential rains began in early July, fueled by a series of typhoons. Water accumulated continuously, overflowing rivers and reservoirs. On August 18, 1931, the Yellow River finally broke its banks, unleashing a torrent that swept away everything in its path. The water spread across vast areas, flooding cities and fields, covering millions of hectares of fertile land. Homes were swept away, and crops were submerged. Millions of people were trapped by the flood, left without shelter or hope as the waters advanced mercilessly. It's estimated that between 1 and 4 million people lost their lives, whether from drowning, disease, or the famine that followed. Farmland was devastated, leading to a severe food shortage and plunging the country into an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. The Great Shanxi Earthquake. In the early hours of January 23, 1556, the province of Shanxi was struck by a massive earthquake. It became the deadliest earthquake in recorded history. The ground, quiet for centuries, began to shake violently. The earthquake, estimated at a magnitude of 8 on the Richter scale, unleashed its full force. In an instant, buildings collapsed like houses of cards. Traditional homes made of earth crumbled, burying occupants under piles of rubble. One reason for the widespread devastation was the region's geography. Many people lived in dwellings called yaodongs, man-made caves dug into the mountains. When the earthquake struck, entire hillsides collapsed, burying families who lived in these caves. The earthquake didn't only affect human structures. The land itself seemed to turn against its inhabitants. Large-scale cracks opened in the ground, mountains collapsed, and rivers changed course, causing floods. An estimated 830,000 people lost their lives, making the Shanxi earthquake the deadliest in human history. The eruption of Laki. On June 8, 1783 in Iceland, a fissure in the ground began to open. For 8 months, the volcano spewed rivers of lava and enormous columns of toxic gases. The ground shook constantly as magma flowed without end. Explosions sent ash and gases into the air, shrouding the area in perpetual twilight. Lava devastated villages, and poisonous gases contaminated the air and water. "50% of Iceland's livestock died, leading to widespread famine among the population. One in 4 people perished, but the effects of Laki's eruption extended beyond Iceland. Toxic gases, especially sulfur dioxide, spread across Europe, forming a haze that blanketed the continent through the summer of 1783. Temperatures dropped sharply, crops failed, and famine spread, sparking riots and worsening the economic crisis of the time. In Asia, weakened monsoons caused droughts, impacting food production. The Bhopal disaster. On the night of December 2nd, 1984, in the city of Bhopal, India, tragedy began to unfold at a pesticide plant. A failure in the safety systems allowed a highly toxic gas, methyl isocyanate, to start leaking uncontrollably. By 12:30 a.m., a lethal cloud of gas spread across the city, reaching sleeping residents. The gas seeped into homes, streets, and marketplaces. The effects were immediate. Thousands began coughing, experiencing eye burns, and suffocating in their homes. Within hours, 3,000 people had died, most while trying to escape the toxic gas. In the weeks that followed, the death toll rose, surpassing 15,000 victims. The water, air, and soil were left contaminated, affecting future generations with chronic health issues and birth defects. Krakatoa, the firestorm. On the morning of August 27, 1883, at 10 a.m., a series of massive explosions shook the island of Krakatoa in Indonesia. The main eruption unleashed energy equivalent to 200 megatons of TNT. The sound was so powerful that it was heard nearly 5,000 kilometers away, reaching as far as Australia. The shockwaves from the explosion traveled around the globe and were recorded for up to 5 days. The sky remained in darkness for days. The sea, stirred by tremendous force, generated tsunamis that raced at terrifying speeds. Waves battered the shores of nearby islands, dismantling entire villages and leaving a path of destruction. An estimated 36,000 people died, many swept away by tsunamis or buried under ash. The massive amount of volcanic ash released into the atmosphere caused global climate change. Winters became much colder, and summers cooler for several years. The ash scattered in the atmosphere created stunning red sunsets and sunrises worldwide for months. These phenomena were so captivating, they inspired artwork, including sunset paintings by British artist William Ashcroft. The deadly avalanche of Yungay. On May 31st, 1970, at 3:23 p.m., the ground shook violently in the Ancash region of Peru. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake rattled the Andes. It dislodged a vast block of ice and rock from its northern peak, triggering an avalanche. Mixed with snow and mud, it rushed down the mountain like a river, burying the small town of Yongye. Homes, trees, and people were engulfed under a blanket of mud, ice, and debris. Out of Yongye's approximately 25,000 residents, only 400 survived, many of them children, who had been taken to a traveling circus. The Wanggongchang Explosion. On May 30th, 1626, in the bustling city of Beijing, China, an ordinary day turned into tragedy. Around noon, a deafening blast echoed throughout the capital of the Ming Empire. The Wanggongchang Munitions Depot, located in the heart of the city, had exploded with overwhelming force. The explosion was so powerful, it obliterated much of the city. Buildings, temples, and homes were reduced to rubble, and the air filled with dust. A mushroom-shaped cloud rose over Beijing. Fragments of stone, wood, and metal rained down, as if the city were under attack. The streets became a scene of chaos and death. It's estimated that around 20,000 people lost their lives in that tragic moment. The cause of the explosion was never fully determined. Some suggested it was an accident involving stored gunpowder, while others believed it was sabotage by enemies of the empire. The Halifax Explosion. On December 6, 1917, in the harbor of Halifax, Canada, a cold winter day turned into a nightmare. At 9 a.m., two ships, the French freighter SS Mont Blanc and the Belgian steamer SS Imo, collided in the narrow harbor channel. The Mont Blanc, loaded with wartime explosives, caught fire, and disaster quickly unfolded. The resulting explosion was the most powerful the world had seen up to that point, equivalent to 3 kilotons of TNT. The blast was so violent that the ship obliterated and a shockwave spread across the city. Surrounding areas were leveled, and the harbor was destroyed. The sea, disturbed by the explosion, pulled back, before surging in a tidal wave, flooding the lower parts of the city. Chaos reigned as fires spread through the streets, fueled by spilled oil. 2,000 people were killed and another 9,000 were injured. The Yellowstone super eruption. Around 640,000 years ago, the ground beneath what we now know as Yellowstone in North America began to swell, a sign that something catastrophic was brewing. Beneath the surface, a massive magma chamber was building pressure until the Earth could no longer contain it. The explosion that followed was one of the most powerful in the planet's history. A super eruption unleashed a force equivalent to thousands of atomic bombs. The sky darkened as a massive cloud of ash and toxic gases spread outward. Volcanic ash blanketed much of North America, covering the land in a gray, barren layer. The effects were global. The sun was obscured, and worldwide temperatures dropped, causing a volcanic winter that lasted for years. Animal and plant life took a severe blow. The American mammoth, a large herbivore roaming the North American plains, was heavily impacted. The sudden loss of vegetation drastically reduced their food supply, leading to a decline in their population. The saber-toothed tiger was another large predator that faced extinction. With prey populations dwindling, it struggled to survive in an increasingly competitive environment. Thus, nature and humankind remind us of their power. In every catastrophe, history is written with pain and resilience. In these cataclysmic events, the fragility and strength of our existence are revealed.